thank you so much for having me. Usually when I do presentations, they're rather longer and I kind of play a presentation golf. I want to get through as few slides as possible because so many people are asking me questions. Given that I have 20 minutes to speed run the last 105 weeks of our generative Gibbet 4, and I say Gibbet, I'm just to preface this, mostly because it means that I never transpose the P and the T, but also because it's funny. So the last 105 or so weeks from the release of Gibbet 4 with Bing Sydney, this is a speed run. I'm going to be going very quickly. This is also intended to have time for questions and answers. And so please post your questions in chat. My slides are up on Zenodo, licensed CC BY, so feel free to reuse them. I am going to be jumping back and forth between my slides and interaction as we go. So without further ado, if you take nothing else from my presentation today, know, first off, that large language models are not search engines. They have no relationship to facts. When we're talking about using them for research, when we're talking about using them for data processing, remember that they are vibe engines. One of my preprints describes them as a map of no territory, right? So if you think about maps, they point to territories. An LLM is this map where the underlying territory has been scrubbed away. They transform text. They engage in pattern matching. They think about tool use. They think about all of this thing as a series of vibes. Just because they predict the next token, however, does not mean that they're not useful. But these things are, to quote Douglas Adams, not your plastic pal who's fun to be with. We must think of them as tools, as things with specific capabilities. And at the end of the day, these things are, to quote Benjamin Breen, and here we go with me pulling things up. The thing is, LLMs are deeply, inherently textual, and they're reliant on text in a way that is directly linked to the skills and methods that we emphasize in university humanities classes. And so I'm just going to drop links in as I remember before I close each tab. And so if you take nothing else from my talk, thinking about how you engage with these
Brian,
tools.
sorry, could you please bring your microphone slightly close to you?
Of course.
Yeah.
Sound check. Sound check, sound check. Sound check.
Slightly closer, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think Zoom is just going to be compensating for that, so we'll do as what we can. So remember that these things are not search engines, and how you prompt them matters. But more to the point, they engage in inference on the next token. And so I find that this little tiny toy, perplexity.versal.app, is a wonderful intuition pump for that purpose, because you can see how likely Gibbet 2 is to predict each subsequent token. And this is a wonderful way of visualizing what's going on under the hood. Can you please mute, please? Whoever's. Thank you. My next thing is, what's behind the chat interface? Because the problem with the chat interface here is that it obscures the technical reality underneath. It obscures the inference happening. And so what we have is a combination of a system prompt, a user prompt, the assistance responses, and the management of the context window. To go very briefly, the context window is the sum total of tokens of which the large language model performs inference upon. The system prompt is essential when we are doing any work with this for research, especially when we move beyond the friendly chatbot interface, in deep quotes, because We control the vibes through the system prompt. We control the text through our prompts to it. And we control the output by figuring out how to get the AI to prompt itself. And so when you're engaging with these things, regardless of if you're using the chatbot interface or if you're using a Python interface, be absolutely mindful of how all of these different parts interact to predict the next token. This is where tools matter. One thing I want you all to remember is training is not the same as chatting. When we engage in token inference, i.e. predicting the next token in response to our prompts, regardless of from the chatbot or from the API, we are not training the models. They're operating in read-only mode. Not to say that there aren't privacy implications and that you as researchers are obligated to read the terms of service and the privacy policies of the tools you're using. Because what they do with your data after the fact matters. But the greatest risk here is not that it learns from your text, but that your account is breached or there's no security applied to it in the first place. Anyone using the DeepSeek app should stop. But can someone mute whomever that is, please?
Please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And so, brain. Be mindful of the terms of service and be mindful of the modalities of use. Okay. So here's a little infographic that my colleague and I generated to give you a sense of how to go about prompting. Today's talk is not about prompting, so I'm not going to be covering this in detail, but those of you who are interested, this resource is in fact available. API, the application programming interface, is the way that a computer talks to another computer. It is the way that we can use these models for research purposes. There are 5 things that you really need to take into account when you're using the API. First, privacy. As I was saying, the distinct terms of service change, not simply provider to provider, not simply model to model, but mode of use. If you're using the API, a different privacy policy applies vis-a-vis OpenAI and Anthropic. Pay attention to your modality of use. Usually the API is far more privacy preserving than the chatbot mode. So when we're using this for research, when we're using this for sensitive tasks, always use the API. Second, the budget. Most of the time, price per token is much cheaper than a monthly fee. There's a big old asterisk there, but for any given scale, usually the price per token is vastly, vastly cheaper. When we're doing research, we're usually operating on real amounts of data, and therefore our obligation is to consider the budgetary implications of the thing. Provenance. There are 2 aspects of provenance here. The first aspect is, of course, terms of service, but the second aspect is the ability to assert exactly what model you're using. So here, in this case, I'm using Claude 3.5 Sonnet 2024 1022, and you can set the temperature. For the temperature to be very brief, a temperature of 0 is the most reproducible. You are always going to get the same output for the same input star when the temperature is set to 0. Note that input is highly nuanced there, and there might be some variation, but usually it'll be the same. But that means that when you're running this on a bunch of words and you're getting the same characteristic output per word, every time I click run, I will get these sentences. And so when I'm using this to generate research materials, this is very useful to me even though, let's be quite clear, the sentences are incredibly boring when I have temperature 0. And so therefore, when you're engaged in research for this, being intentional about the temperature that you're setting is very important. And of course, this leads into control, because when you're using the API, either through the, hey, I'm just going to play around with it, dashboards that both Anthropic and OpenAI provide, or through a program, for example, nope, there we are. You control the system prompt in totality. You control the user prompts in totality. And here's the deep, dark, dirty secret. You control the assistant prompts in totality. You can simply edit the assistant prompts. And so when you're engaging with this for software development or what have you, right? And so here, for example, we have this. I can start filling out the AI's response. If I continued this, I could just edit the assistant's response. This is a wonderful way of working when you know what the error is and just want to fix the error instead of explaining to the oh so apologetic chatbot where the error is. And so this is a wonderful way of engaging with large language models for research purposes. And of course, last and certainly not least, scale. When we engage with large language models at the API level, we can get so much higher scale than via chatbot. It's not even funny. There are times when you want to use the console, i.e., well, what I just showed you, and there are times when you want to use programs. For example, a colleague came to me last year and needed an index for her book. And so I forked some code and I built a program that could reproducibly harvest each page of her book and run prompts against both, at that time, Gpit-4 Omni and Claude 3.5 Sonnet to get them to respond with structured data for their suggestions of what index terms would appear on that page. That's a far more appropriate thing for the program. When you're just playing with prompts, however, it's far more important to play with the console because it allows for much more effective and much quicker iteration. I will also note some tools here, and I'm going super fast. That's why this is recorded. The first thing that I want to reference is what used to be Microsoft Guidance. Guidance is a way of using an LLM within a Jupyter notebook, within the structure of the Jupyter notebook. And so when you need extremely constrained outputs as a function of sentence level inputs, where you're going back and forth from user input to assistant input, not in the context of a conversation, but in the context of structured, iterated inputs, variable by variable, pay attention to guidance. The other tool that I'm going to be highlighting is Microsoft's Presidio. Microsoft has a bunch of tiny little open source tools that are amazing. I'm not going to speak about Microsoft Copilot Chat because it's not. But Presidio is wonderful for data protection, de-identification. And so, for example, here is a transcript of a student output that I gave as an assignment that I'm working on de-identifying for some upcoming publications. And it's gone through and pulled out the student name, the student ID, and any other names or URLs that have come through. It's not perfect. But in terms of reducing and minimizing PII, I definitely want to draw your attention to Presidio as a tool that can run on your local computer using large language models to identify PII and remove it. Okay, so we've done that. We've done rapid iteration. At present, for research purposes, I don't find many of Google's products very persuasive. This changes. It's a race. Only a fortnight ago did OpenAI release deep research, at which point I had to start paying attention to their models again. I find O1 Pro to be quite persuasive from a research capability standpoint. I did not find their prior models to be persuasive. As researchers, the point that I want to make here is there is a affirmative obligation not merely to have your one perfect model, but to pay attention to a bunch of different models and to fundamentally to think of them as tools that you can swap out, just like we choose between programming languages and libraries within programming languages. Each one of these, each company and each one of these AIs, each one of these LLMs has different affordances and different places of specific utility that we as researchers need to be aware of and to engage at where they are, not what we say. To get back to research, what 3 of my undergraduates did last semester was build a bibliography of all of the literature on Caligula's madness. And so they went through 160 sources and they built this. The reason I'm highlighting this is this actually shows something really important. These annotated bibliographies, these are not summaries. Summarization requires induction, which most large language models are absolutely pants at, to elide myself somewhat. Instead, what they did is they caused the large language model to operate deductively, and their prompts are at the end, so you can get a sense of this, and to answer specific questions about this. This is far more effective a way of, through deduction and through tautological transformation of a text, to elicit useful information from a larger text into a smaller text. And this is a way of working at scale that is valid for us as researchers when we're dealing with literature, but also us as researchers when we are dealing with cleaning and extracting salient points from our data. Another thing I want to mention, because we have about 3 minutes, is being transparent is important. It is incorrect to merely acknowledge your use when you use these things. It is incorrect to say, oh, I use this for this and that. Because here's the thing. How do we know where you exercise your judgment? How can we judge your expertise, your knowledge, and your context without seeing your prompts? I believe that we are in a period of, to nod towards Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, revolutionary science, where the old modes of explaining facts and creating knowledge are starting to be challenged with new modes. Note that I am not saying whether or not this is good, right? I'm not saying whether or not this is good, but I am sensing that we are entering a new paradigm. But we are not there yet. I don't know if we will achieve this transformation. I do not know if we should achieve this transformation. But what I do know is when we are engaged with this, when we have our research, it is our affirmative obligation to give our system prompts and every single chat log that we do with these large language models when we are working with them in public research. Because at the end of the day, I don't know what the appropriate use is, or rather, I don't know how it will be judged in 5 years. And therefore, people will be able to review how I've used a large language model in the context of my research, and will be able to review whether or not it is appropriate. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions. If you want to email me, I am happy that you contact me. These slides are Creative Commons. Almost all of my work is fair and open licensed, and these slides are available on Zenodo. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was very innovative speech and also in terms of research and education. And I think this is one of the first speeches we hear about reproducibility of large language models research. That's brilliant, and I wish you success. We do have time for some questions, so you probably have fascinated everybody. Any questions from the audience? While we wait for another question, sorry, I have one. In the sense that, like, you know, a lot of this is quite overwhelming for a lot of researchers, right? There's so many tools out there.
Oh yes.
So I'm great that you have a number of resources, and this will be very useful for a community. But like, if somebody who's starting out and not necessarily somebody with programming experience, because many researchers are not inherent programmers, so what is your like kind of wisdom or advice for them?
Take notes. So what you see in front of you is an assignment by one of my students, where what I had them do is output their entire chat log and annotate the chat log. Note, I did not get them to merely correct the AI, right? This is not a scared straight thing, for lack of a more explicit term. What I asked them to do is I asked them to look at their prompts and to look at the outputs and to figure out if their prompts cause them to be satisfied with the outputs. And so here you can see that the student is annotating where they failed in their prompting, right? You can see where they said, oh, I asked the query twice and it produced a bad result. So when you folks are learning to prompt, first off, it's not a search engine. Don't give a one-liner. If you're getting your answer in your first question, your prompt is a bad prompt and you should feel bad. Instead, pay attention to how you're prompting, pay attention to how you're setting it up, pay attention to what information you're giving it, and then print it out and literally highlight what was good and what was bad, and try to find correlations between your prompting and the things that you find satisfying, because everything's changing. Every large language model takes a slightly different mode of prompting. And so you need to find your mode of interaction for a given LLM version that produces satisfying results for yourself. And the only way you can do that is by annotating your own work.